Hey everybody, Arnaldo here broadcasting from Fidelio's Frequency. Welcome to my channel and welcome to another episode of The Sun Shines Out of Our Behinds, the mini-series that focuses on the music of the Smiths. As you probably have noticed from the artwork behind me, today we will be talking about Meat is Murder, the second studio album by the Smiths, which celebrates its 40th anniversary. We'll take a deep dive into Meat is Murder, but first, cue the intro and I will see you in a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, Meat is Murder is the second studio album released by the Smiths. It is the third album released by the Smiths, if we're also counting Hatful of Hollow, which was a compilation of singles as well as radio sessions, which I spoke about in another video that you can also find on my channel. That one was released in November of 1984. So fast forward to today's release, the 40th anniversary of the release of the Smiths' Meat is Murder was released on February 11th of 1985. Following the release of their first album, the Smiths were living in London, precisely around Earl's Court, and started composing songs that would become the follow-up singles to the first album that were released throughout 1984, as well as some of the songs that would form the bulk of the material for Meat is Murder. However, the Smiths felt that they wanted to return home, back to Manchester, and they chose a studio not far from Liverpool called Amazon Studios, where they would record Meat is Murder. At this point, the Smiths had gained a lot of experience, and precisely Johnny Marr, a lot of experience in the studio, working with John Porter, who produced the first album as well as all of the subsequent singles that were released after the first album. And they felt that they might want to attempt producing the album on their own because the first album, they were not entirely satisfied with the sound and some of the overdubs of the first album, that they felt they wanted to take a stab at producing the album themselves. More importantly, Johnny Marr covered most of the producer duties for Meat is Murder, even though the album is credited as produced by the Smiths. As I mentioned earlier, the bulk of the songs did come from the most recent writing sessions that Johnny Marr and Morrissey were having, but there were two songs that stem back to probably around the recording of the first album, more precisely Barbarism Begins at Home and The Headmaster Ritual. The Smiths drafted in Stephen Street, who they had worked with on a few sessions for some of the singles released after the first album, to cover the duties of engineer, sitting behind the console. And we see that Stephen Street appears pretty much on all of the subsequent releases as sound engineer, and sometimes even getting a producer credit for the rest of the Smiths' career, leading or bleeding into the beginning of Morrissey's solo career with Viva Hate. With Meat is Murder, the Smiths started to venture into slightly different music genres compared to their debut album. We have the appearance of two rockabilly tracks, namely the tracks Nowhere Fast and Rush Home Ruffians. We have garage rock that is represented by the track What She Said, and almost a punk funk kind of track, and that would be Barbarism Begins at Home, one of my favorite Smiths tracks, and probably the best bass line, the best bass riff that Andy Rourke has ever played on any Smiths song. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the lyrical content within the songs featured on Meat is Murder. Whereas the debut album read more like Morrissey's personal journal or personal diary, very personal lyrics, sometimes autobiographical, Meat is Murder shows Morrissey now utilizing his craft as a lyricist, almost as a soapbox for his political and personal views. Yes, we do have some personal, more intimate moments as in the song Well, I Wonder, there are some very strong lyrical outbursts, starting from the Headmaster Ritual, which is the opening track to the album, in which Morrissey denounces and exposes the abuses of the UK educational system. Morrissey also takes a jab, one of the many he will throughout his career, at the monarchy on Nowhere Fast. And lastly, I'd like to point out the title track, Meat is Murder, which is Morrissey's manifesto to vegetarianism, as well as depicting and describing the cruelty against animals. I'd like to dive a little deeper into the track Meat is Murder. At some point during the recording of the album, Morrissey approached the band suggesting that the title of the second album be Meat is Murder, to which they all agreed. And at that point, there was no title track. So Johnny Marr went back to the band, crafted and put together the backing track, the music backing track for the song Meat is Murder, giving it a haunting, almost a horror feel. It is a waltz, and he punctuated this to give it almost, again, that horror movie feel with this tingling piano riff, which is very eerie and very reminiscent of a horror movie. Provided the backing tape to Morrissey, who overnight wrote the lyrics and the following day came into the studio and delivered the vocal performance, which is the performance that you hear on the album. Yes, it was done in one take. None of the tracks on Meat is Murder were released as singles leading up to the album release. They were extracted subsequently, starting off with That Joke Isn't Funny Anymore, except for one. And here's when we talk about the version that came out in the United States, which featured a previously issued song, How Soon Is Now, formerly a B-side, then elevated to its own 12-inch single as an A-side. This song started garnering a lot of attention in the United States. Many radio stations, namely college radio stations, were playing the song, and it had become the most popular song, or the most known song, by the Smiths. Seymour Stein, the head of the US label Sire, which was releasing the Smiths' albums, proposed to include the track on the album. Johnny Marr and Morrissey highly objected to that, and unfortunately, Seymour Stein had his way. He thought that the track would help promote the sales of the album, and it is featured as the opening track on the second side of the album. However, the artwork does not show that it is included on the US version, except for a hype sticker, which unfortunately I no longer have. I misplaced it in the last 40 years, and it did indicate includes How Soon Is Now. In addition to the version released in the United States, Canada also had the extra track How Soon Is Now, as well as Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. And it was also featured on the cassette version of the US release, and it is listed as an additional track, as well as the first version of the CD in the US, which lists and includes How Soon Is Now. And just as a little curiosity, I wanted to show side by side the two versions. The US version and the UK version, as you could see, have slightly different colorations, whereas the UK is more of a greenish tint, almost maybe sepia tone, and the US version has kind of like a pinkish hue, still saying the same artwork, but just slightly different coloration of the album cover. Meat is Murder went to #1 on the UK charts when it was released in 1985, and it is the only album by the Smiths to reach the top spot. Unfortunately, Seymour Stein's effort to promote the album with the inclusion of How Soon Is Now only garnered a position of 110 on the Billboard charts. And that leads us to talk about the artwork featured on the album cover. Morrissey chose an image taken from a 1968 documentary about Vietnam called In the Year of the Pig by Emile D'Antonio. And the image that he chose, and as it's credited in the sleeve, the image of an unknown soldier slightly reworking the message that the soldier had inscripted on his helmet, from changing it from "Make Love, Not War" to "Meat is Murder," to fit the message that Morrissey wanted to convey. And as a matter of fact, that is the only type of font or type of inscription depicting the name of the album, so quite subtle. And further research has led us to the name of this soldier. His name is Marine Corporal Michael Wynn. He was only 20 years old when this picture was taken on September 21st, 1967. And lastly, the etchings in the runout groove of the vinyl, provided by Morrissey and Johnny Marr. Side A by Morrissey is Illness Art, and side B by Johnny Marr is doing the Wythenshawe waltz. I think the reference is the waltz is to the type of song Meat is Murder, and Wythenshawe is the area of Manchester where Johnny Marr grew up. And now some final thoughts on Meat is Murder, the album, or at least my personal thoughts. I find that Meat is Murder is a bit more focused. Definitely it shows a band that has found their sound, a lot more at ease in the studio, definitely more confident to the point where they feel confident enough to take on their own production duties rather than an external producer. I will have to say that it is a thin sounding album at times, maybe a little more bleak sounding. And I think I remember reading Johnny Marr also stating pretty much the same, that it was a thin sounding album. Nonetheless, it is a brilliant album, has some of the most iconic songs from the Smiths, namely Barbarism Begins at Home, the title track Meat is Murder, the Headmaster Ritual, That Joke Isn't Funny Anymore. I think I've named probably half of the album. So that pretty much wraps it up for this episode of The Sun Shines Out of Our Behinds, our mini-series on the music of the Smiths. Please feel free to check out some of the other episodes of the series, as well as some of the other videos on Fidelio's Frequency. Hit that like button if you enjoy the music of the Smiths, if you like Meat is Murder, if you like this video, or even a thumbs down if you don't. Feel free to leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Meat is Murder, or some of your memories regarding Meat is Murder, as well as asking me some questions, and I will try my best to answer them. And lastly, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel grow, gain more visibility. No, I'm not roping you into some pyramid scheme, no subscription model. It is totally free. It just helps the channel grow and gain more visibility. Hit that notification bell if you want to also receive notifications of future videos dropping on Fidelio's Frequency. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye.